Hello there. Tonight, I ask you, have you ever wondered what it felt like to stand helpless as an entire city burned around you? For London's firefighters in 1666, this wasn't imagination. It was their nightmare. With no protective gear, no hoses, and no coordinated fire service, these men ran toward danger anyway. So how did they try to save a doomed city? The answer will change how you see modern fire safety forever. London, in September 1666, was a disaster waiting to happen. The city had endured one of the hottest, driest summers in memory. The wooden buildings were parched, their thatched roofs brittle as tinder. Narrow streets barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass meant flames could jump easily from one structure to the next. This wasn't just a city, it was a giant bonfire that hadn't been lit yet. Most homes were crammed together with no space between them. Wealthy merchants lived above their shops, storing flammable goods like oil, rope, and gunpowder in basement cellars. The poorest residents slept in attics just below the thatch, where sparks would find them first. Overhanging upper stories made the streets feel like wooden tunnels, perfect for channeling fire. There hadn't been a major blaze in decades, so no one remembered how quickly disaster could strike. The city's fire defences were laughable by modern standards. Each parish owned a few leather buckets and some ladders stored in the local church. There were no fire engines, no hoses, no trained crews. When a fire broke out, the church bells would ring backwards as a warning, and any able-bodied man was expected to help. They used primitive tools like fire hooks, long poles with iron hooks to pull down burning thatch. Bucket brigades passed water hand to hand from the nearest well or the Thames, but most wells were shallow and ran dry quickly in the drought. London's government knew the risks. Just 3 years earlier, King Charles II had warned about the danger of narrow streets and overhanging buildings, but no one wanted to pay for improvements. The wealthy resisted taxes for public safety, while the poor had no choice but to live in fire traps. The city's 17 fire wardens could issue fines for unsafe chimneys, but enforcement was spotty. Many homes still had medieval-style open hearths that spat embers onto the floor. Firefighters in 1666 weren't professionals. They were volunteers with day jobs. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and bakers would drop their tools when the alarm sounded. They had no protective clothing beyond their regular wool coats and leather boots. No one had thought to design masks against smoke inhalation. When fighting fires at night, they worked by the flickering light of torches and lanterns, which sometimes started new blazes. The system worked well enough for small fires. A chimney blaze might blacken a few walls, but the bucket brigades could usually contain it. What no one planned for was a fire that outran the volunteers, jumping streets faster than men could run. The city's layout made coordinated firefighting nearly impossible. Narrow alleys twisted unpredictably, dead-ending at courtyards or blocked by gates. Even finding the source of smoke could take precious minutes. When deciding which buildings to save, firefighters followed simple rules. They prioritized churches and government buildings, then wealthy homes that might pay rewards. The poor watched as their homes burned while firefighters protected structures with political connections. Sometimes they deliberately knocked down a row of houses to create a firebreak, but this required the mayor's approval, and he often hesitated until it was too late. Water supplies were another critical weakness. The city's few reservoirs held barely enough for daily needs, let alone firefighting. The Thames could provide unlimited water, but carrying it uphill through narrow streets took too long. Some wealthier districts had primitive wooden pipes, but these often leaked or ran dry. Firefighters sometimes had to choose between saving a building or letting it burn to preserve water for the next block. By September 2nd, conditions were perfect for catastrophe. The drought had left the city's wood and plaster as dry as parchment. A strong east wind was blowing, ready to push flames across the rooftops. All it needed was a spark, and that spark would come from a small bakery on Pudding Lane. The baker claimed he'd damped his ovens properly that night, but no one would ever know for sure. When the first flames licked up the bakery walls, the city's fate was sealed. The fire began quietly, like so many others before it. Thomas Fariner, the King's baker on Pudding Lane, checked his ovens before bed on September 1st. By 1 a.m. on Sunday, his maid noticed flames climbing the bakery walls. A single spark had jumped from the oven to nearby bundles of dry wood. Fariner and his family barely escaped through an upstairs window as smoke filled their home. Neighbours formed a bucket brigade, passing water hand to hand from the nearest well. This was standard procedure for a house fire, and at first, no one thought this one would be different. But 3 critical errors doomed London that night. First, the firefighters couldn't access the bakery's narrow alley quickly. The street was cluttered with carts and debris, slowing bucket lines. Second, they focused only on saving adjacent homes rather than creating fire breaks. Without training, they didn't realize how fast flames could spread in drought conditions. Third, no one woke the mayor immediately. By the time word reached officials, the fire had already jumped to neighboring roofs. The tools available to firefighters were woefully inadequate. Leather buckets often sprang leaks after a few uses. Fire hooks could pull down burning thatch, but required getting dangerously close to collapsing walls. Ladders were too short for London's 3-story buildings. Volunteers had no axes to chop through doors blocking escape routes or water access. Some used wet rags wrapped around their faces as makeshift smoke masks, but these did little against the thickening black clouds. Fire spread followed predictable but ignored patterns. Embers rode the strong east wind onto dry thatch roofs up to 40 yards away. Heat radiating from burning buildings ignited adjacent structures before flames even touched them. Timber-framed houses acted like kindling, their pitched roofs creating natural chimneys that pulled fire upward. The Great Fire moved at about 15 feet per minute, slow enough to outpace, but too fast for bucket brigades to contain. Different parish crews failed to coordinate. St. Margaret's team focused on saving their church, while neighbouring St. Magnus's men protected the waterfront. No central command existed to direct resources where they were needed most. Fire wardens argued about jurisdiction instead of pooling buckets and manpower. Private firefighting companies hired by wealthy citizens wasted time protecting single homes while entire blocks burned nearby. Communication broke down almost immediately. Church bells across the city rang backward alarms, creating confusion about the fire's location. Runners sent to fetch the mayor got lost in twisting alleys filled with smoke. Written orders from officials often arrived hours late because normal courier routes were blocked by flames. Firefighters relied on shouted rumors about which direction the fire was heading next. By dawn on Sunday, the fire had already destroyed 300 homes along the riverfront. Flames leaped across Thames Street, igniting warehouses full of oil, tallow, and coal. The mayor finally arrived at daybreak but refused to order demolitions for fire breaks, fearing the cost of compensating property owners. His hesitation proved disastrous. Heat became so intense that stone walls exploded and lead roofing melted into the streets. Volunteer firefighters faced impossible choices. Some prioritized saving churches as community landmarks, while others focused on homes where trapped residents screamed from windows. Without hydrants, teams rotated between carrying water and carrying victims. Many worked barefoot after their leather shoes burned away. The Thames became both water source and escape route as desperate citizens waded into the river to avoid the heat. As Sunday wore on, the fire began outpacing human effort. Flames created their own wind pattern, sucking air inward like a furnace. This pulled fresh oxygen into the fire while hurling burning debris ahead of the main blaze. Firefighters who had contained small neighborhood fires before found themselves overwhelmed. The eastern third of London would be ashes by nightfall, with no sign of stopping. But even in the chaos, systems developed. Experienced builders took charge of demolition crews, identifying which buildings to topple to block the fire's path. Apprentices formed chains to pass tools forward and carried the injured back. Clerics used church records to direct firefighters toward neighborhoods with elderly residents. The very lack of formal training forced volunteers to improvise solutions no manual could have predicted. By Sunday evening, the fire had transformed from a local emergency into a citywide catastrophe. Flames glowed so brightly that ships on the Thames could read by their light at midnight. The king himself would take charge within hours. But for now, exhausted firefighters kept working with blistered hands and smoke-ravaged lungs. Their greatest trial still lay ahead as winds shifted overnight, driving the fire westward into London's wealthy districts. The firefighters of 1666 had essentially the same tools their great-grandfathers used: leather buckets, iron hooks, and ladders. Each parish kept these basic supplies in the local church, maintained by volunteers who might fight 1 or 2 chimney fires a year. When the Great Fire started, they grabbed their usual equipment without realizing how useless it would prove against an inferno of this scale. Bucket brigades formed quickly, but struggled immediately. A typical brigade needed at least 50 men to be effective. One line passing full buckets forward, another returning the empties. The best crews could move about 120 gallons per minute. But with the fire spreading so fast, men often arrived to find their assigned well already drained by another crew. Those who tried using the Thames faced a different problem. Carrying seawater uphill through narrow streets wasted precious minutes. Many buckets fell apart after hours of use, their stitched seams bursting under constant strain. Fire hooks caused as many problems as they solved. These iron-tipped poles could pull down burning thatch, but required men to stand dangerously close to collapsing buildings. Teams of 6 might spend 15 minutes trying to topple one house, while the fire jumped 3 others. Some hooks snapped from the strain of pulling heavy beams. Others got lodged in collapsing structures, forcing firefighters to abandon them. The constant swinging of these heavy poles exhausted men already struggling to breathe in the smoke. A few wealthier districts had squirts, primitive hand-pumped tubes that could spray water about 15 feet. These required 2 men to operate and held less than a gallon per squeeze. At best, they could dampen one small section of a burning wall. Most broke down after continuous use, their leather seals melting from the heat. Some crews tried soaking blankets in these devices to throw over flames, but the fabric often caught fire mid-air. Firefighters had no protective gear beyond their normal wool coats and leather boots. Wool resisted flames slightly better than linen, but still scorched quickly near intense heat. Boot soles burned away after an hour of standing on hot cobblestones. Men wrapped wet cloth around their faces, but smoke still seared their lungs. Many later described coughing up black phlegm for weeks afterward. Eye injuries were common from flying embers and sparks. The physics of fire worked against them at every turn. As buildings burned, they created convection currents that pulled fresh oxygen into the blaze. This fire wind could reach 60 miles per hour, hurling burning debris hundreds of feet ahead of the main fire. Stone buildings offered little protection. The intense heat caused limestone to explode violently when moisture inside turned to steam. Firefighters learned to listen for the telltale popping sounds that signaled another wall was about to blow apart. Radiation heat posed another invisible danger. Simply standing near certain burning structures could ignite clothing, even if no flames were visible. Firefighters had to constantly check each other's coats for smoldering patches. Some reported feeling their shoes growing unbearably hot moments before the leather burst into flame. The radiating heat also meant any metal tool left on the ground would become too hot to touch within minutes. Communication tools were just as primitive as firefighting equipment. Church bells rang backwards as alarms, but with so many churches burning, the sounds became meaningless. Runners carried messages between crews, but often got lost in smoke-filled alleys or couldn't locate commanders in the chaos. No one had thought to establish rally points or standard signals. Firefighters sometimes abandoned perfectly good positions simply because they couldn't confirm if other crews still held adjacent streets. The greatest danger wasn't the fire itself, but collapsing buildings. Weakened timber frames could give way without warning, burying entire bucket brigades. Firefighters developed a system of lookouts who watched for leaning walls and shouted warnings. But in the noise and confusion, these alerts often went unheard. Many men died simply because they couldn't hear shouts to get clear of a teetering structure. Despite these conditions, firefighters kept entering burning buildings longer than seemed humanly possible. Some wrapped themselves in multiple layers of wet fabric and crawled through smoke-filled rooms searching for trapped residents. Others formed human ladders, standing on each other's shoulders to reach upper windows. The heat became so intense that hair would singe off the backs of their hands as they worked. Courage came in many forms. Blacksmiths used their knowledge of metal to predict which structures would fail first. Young apprentices ran messages between crews despite the danger. Clerics, who normally spent their days copying manuscripts, now carried children through flaming streets. The lack of proper tools forced unimaginable improvisation. One crew reportedly used a stolen bed frame as a makeshift stretcher to carry burn victims. By the second day, even these desperate measures were failing. The fire had grown too large for bucket brigades to matter. Crews started prioritizing certain neighborhoods, making harsh calculations about which could still be saved. Some men worked until they collapsed, then got back up after a few minutes' rest. As the firestorm intensified, it became clear the old methods were useless. London's survival would require something far more drastic: the controlled destruction of entire city blocks to starve the flames of fuel. By Monday morning, London's citizens realized the fire wasn't just someone else's problem. As flames leaped across entire streets, officials began pressing every able-bodied person into service. Wealthy merchants stood shoulder to shoulder with dock workers, passing buckets along human chains that stretched for blocks. Women and children formed secondary lines carrying food and water to exhausted firefighters. Even prisoners were temporarily released from jail to help, their guards watching closely as they worked. Untrained volunteers created as many problems as they solved. Some panicked at the first sight of flames, breaking bucket lines to flee. Others wasted energy saving unimportant items. one group reportedly carried someone's feather mattress to safety while a neighboring house burned. Well-meaning citizens often blocked narrow streets with carts of salvaged goods, hampering fire crews. The noise of shouting crowds made it impossible to hear warnings about collapsing buildings. The most effective volunteers followed soldiers' directions without question. Navy sailors proved especially valuable, using their experience with ships' pumps to organize water supplies. Young apprentices knew the city's back alleys perfectly, guiding bucket brigades through smoke-filled shortcuts. Booksellers from Paternoster Row formed human ladders to rescue people from upper floors, passing children hand to hand like stacks of merchandise. Makeshift fire breaks became the city's last hope. Teams of 30 to 50 men would swarm a condemned building, smashing doors with borrowed axes and crowbars. Once cleared of occupants, they'd loop ropes around support beams and pull in unison. The technique resembled shipboard drills, coordinated heaving that could topple a house in minutes. These crude demolition crews sometimes misjudged collapses, burying neighboring structures under rubble and unintentionally feeding the fire. Psychologically, the disaster created strange alliances. Normally, hostile guilds worked together without complaint. Puritans who despised theatre folk accepted help from actors carrying water from the Tiber stream. Witnesses reported seeing Catholic priests and Anglican ministers taking turns praying over the same injured firefighter. The shared crisis temporarily erased social divisions, until the flames passed and old tensions resurfaced. Certain individuals emerged as unlikely leaders. A one-legged shipwright named Richard Shepherd directed demolition crews with his crutch, spotting which beams would bring down entire rows at once. A teenage milkmaid named Agnes organized her entire street into rotating shifts, ensuring fresh relief every 2 hours. The most famous was Baker Thomas Fariner, whose shop started the fire, working tirelessly to save others' homes despite threats from angry neighbors. Rescue attempts grew increasingly desperate. Some firefighters tunneled through shared attic spaces to reach trapped families, crawling on burnt forearms through suffocating heat. Others lowered children from windows using knotted bedsheets, forming nets of outstretched arms below. Near St. Paul's, a group of lawyers used their robes as makeshift stretchers for burn victims. The most harrowing accounts describe parents throwing babies from upper windows into crowds of strangers, praying someone would catch them. The physical toll reshaped survivors permanently. Volunteer John Evelyn wrote that after 2 days, most men's hands were raw flesh from hauling buckets. Many developed permanent limps from stepping on hot embers that burned through shoe leather. A blacksmith named Edward Taylor famously kept working after his beard singed away, his facial skin blistering in the heat. The stench of burned hair and wool clung to rescuers for weeks afterward. Psychological effects ran deeper. Grown men who'd calmly entered burning buildings later sobbed uncontrollably at the sight of cooking fires. Some could never again tolerate the smell of baking bread. It reminded them of Pudding Lane. Several volunteers developed compulsive habits, like constantly checking water barrels even during rainstorms. A few became local celebrities, their fire-blackened coats serving as badges of honor. The human response revealed both the best and worst instincts. Looters followed fire crews, picking through ruins before the embers cooled. But for every thief, there were 10 people offering spare clothes or shelter. Wealthy households that escaped the flames opened their doors to strangers. Churches transformed into makeshift hospitals, where volunteers treated burns with egg whites and wine, the era's closest equivalent to antiseptics. By Monday afternoon, the volunteer army faced its greatest test yet. The fire had jumped the Fleet River's natural barrier and now threatened London's wealthiest district. Here, homeowners resisted demolitions that might save the city but doom their properties. The human chains wavered as rich merchants pulled their servants back to guard personal possessions. For the first time, the volunteer network began fracturing along class lines. Just as the fire entered its most destructive phase, the flames now moved faster than any human effort could contain. Heat radiating ahead of the fire front ignited whole streets before the main blaze arrived. Volunteers entering these neighborhoods risked being encircled by flames with no retreat path. Some crews worked in eerie silence, too exhausted to shout warnings anymore, communicating only through hand signals. Those who paused to rest often collapsed into sleep where they stood, their bodies giving out mid-task. Yet the human wall held in unexpected places. Near Temple Church, law students formed rotating shifts, half working while half slept, curled in cloaks nearby. Printers whose shops had burned used their paper stocking skills to create emergency bandages for burned hands. A group of German merchants who spoke little English nonetheless understood bucket formations perfectly, slotting seamlessly into the lines. The most lasting impact wasn't on buildings, but on people's understanding of community. After 3 days of working side by side with strangers, many volunteers found they couldn't simply return to old social divisions. The fire forged connections between people who would never normally speak, connections that would shape London's rebuilding. But first, the city would have to survive the firestorm's peak, when even this unprecedented human effort would prove insufficient against nature's fury. By Tuesday morning, firefighters faced brutal decisions no training could prepare them for. With the fire raging out of control, they had to choose which parts of London might be saved and which should be abandoned. This wasn't random. Crews followed an unspoken triage system shaped by practical realities. Stone churches and government buildings got priority, not just for their importance, but because their materials might actually resist flames. Next came homes near uncontaminated water sources, where bucket brigades could work effectively. Anything downwind of major fire fronts was usually written off immediately. The morality haunted them. Each demolition meant someone's livelihood destroyed to save others. Firefighter Samuel Pepys wrote of watching a crew tear down a bookseller's shop, knowing it contained the man's entire stock of rare manuscripts. The bookseller screamed protests until a priest reminded him 3 schools full of children lived on the next block. Such scenes repeated across the city. Bakers watching grain stores burn while firefighters soaked neighboring homes. Tavern owners pleading as their barrels of ale were used to wet demolition crews' faces rather than save inventory. Certain losses cut deepest. St. Paul's Cathedral seemed safe behind its stone walls until the lead roof melted, pouring liquid metal down onto the bookseller's stalls, sheltering inside. The Guildhall's archives burned despite firefighters forming a human chain to pass out documents. They saved less than 1/10 of the city's legal records. Wealthy goldsmiths at the Royal Exchange fought to save their shops until the vaults exploded from heat, scattering molten silver across streets like deadly rain. Strategic priorities shifted as the fire advanced. At first, crews protected landmarks. Then they focused on controlling the fire's path. By day 3, most efforts went to preserving escape routes so people could flee westward. Firefighter teams developed crude risk assessments. They'd examine wind direction, building materials, and available water before choosing whether to fight or retreat. Streets with multiple alleys were abandoned first, since flames could circle behind firefighters. Areas near the river got more effort because of water access. Politics influenced choices constantly. The mayor initially refused to demolish wealthy homes, fearing lawsuits. King Charles II later countermanded him, ordering aristocratic mansions razed to save the Fleet Prison. Navy crews focused on protecting dockside warehouses full of naval supplies, while guild firefighters prioritized their members' workshops. One alderman famously bribed a crew with silver coins to save his house. They took the money and collapsed it anyway, judging the neighborhood unsalvageable. The most controversial decisions involved explosives. On Wednesday, the king's advisors insisted gunpowder could create firebreaks faster than muscle power. Untrained crews accidentally blew up several salvageable blocks before Navy gunners took over. Their controlled demolitions at Temple Bar finally stopped the westward march of flames, but only after leveling centuries-old buildings that might have survived the fire itself. Some property owners never forgave what they saw as unnecessary destruction. Personal connections skewed priorities too. Firefighters naturally spent extra effort near their own homes or relatives' businesses. A team from St. Bride's Parish famously worked 36 continuous hours trying to save their church, only to collapse from exhaustion as it burned anyway. Brewery workers formed a private brigade saving ale houses, while printers concentrated on paper warehouses. These biases left entire neighborhoods undefended. No one prioritized tenements full of poor immigrants until the flames reached them. Supplies dictated many choices more than morality. Areas near fish markets got abandoned when the stinking river water clogged pumps. Districts without enough buckets saw firefighters withdraw to more manageable zones. One crew kept working solely because a wine merchant kept bringing them fresh barrels to drink from. The alcohol probably worsened their dehydration, but the gesture bought his block an extra 8 hours of defense. The eastern slums were sacrificed almost immediately. Without property records or political influence, these areas got no demolition teams or bucket brigades. Firefighters assumed, correctly, that tightly packed poor neighborhoods would burn regardless. Some residents stood guard over their homes with axes, threatening any crews who came to pull down buildings preemptively. The result was predictable. The flames consumed these districts completely within hours. Oddly, some random factors determined what survived. A sudden wind shift saved the Tower of London, while dooming several churches. The fire hopscotched over certain streets for no apparent reason, leaving odd pockets untouched amid destruction. One bakery survived because its flour stores exploded early, blowing out the fire that would have consumed it. Firefighters increasingly saw their efforts as futile against such chaos. By the fourth day, priorities simplified to pure survival. Any building still standing behind the fire line got defended, regardless of value. Fire crews stopped discriminating between rich and poor areas. If people were trapped, someone tried to reach them. The exhaustion and scale of destruction leveled the social distinctions that had seemed so important days earlier. As the fire finally burned itself out near Temple Church, what lingered wasn't triumph, but stunned disbelief at how much had been lost, and how arbitrarily some structures had escaped. The smoke became as dangerous as the flames themselves. By the second day, a thick black haze blanketed London, turning noon into twilight. Firefighters described it as trying to navigate through a candlelit room at midnight, except the candle was the entire city burning around them. The smoke didn't just obscure vision, it stung eyes, clenched throats, and left an acrid taste that lingered for days afterward. Navigation turned into a deadly challenge. Fire teams creeping through alleyways had to feel their way along walls, sometimes crawling on hands and knees below the smoke layer. Many got disoriented in familiar streets, walking in circles until they stumbled into burning buildings by accident. Church steeples that normally served as landmarks disappeared in the smog, leaving crews without reference points. Some men tied ropes around their waists, the only way to ensure they could find their way back to safety. The smoke's composition made it especially hazardous. Unlike modern fires that burn standardized materials, the Great Fire consumed everything from wool fabrics to sugar stores, creating a toxic cocktail. Lethal carbon monoxide mixed with chlorine gas from burning salt warehouses. Chemicals in paint pigments released poisonous vapors when heated. Firefighters working near the docks reported vomiting after inhaling smoke from burning whale oil and tar. Even those who avoided flames could collapse suddenly from invisible gases. Physical symptoms started appearing quickly. Men spat up black mucus after just an hour's work. Bloodshot eyes became so common that crews developed a system of leading blindfolded firefighters back to temporary aid stations. Some reported losing their sense of smell entirely by day 2, unable to detect smoke, a dangerous impairment when fire could be creeping up unseen. The constant coughing made it impossible to shout warnings, forcing crews to develop hand signals. Smoke altered perceptions of time and space. Volunteers described working what felt like brief shifts, only to learn they'd toiled for 8 hours straight. The dim, monotonous light confused circadian rhythms. No one knew when to rest or eat. Distances became impossible to judge. A building might appear close through the haze, but require 15 minutes of dangerous travel to reach. This led to tragic miscalculations, like teams exhausting themselves trying to reach structures that had already burned down. The smoke's heat caused its own injuries. Breathing scorched throats so badly that many firefighters could only swallow liquids for days afterward. Wool clothing trapped superheated air against skin, causing burns without direct flame contact. Men reported their eyelashes singeing off from radiant heat, pulsing through the smoke cloud. Some resorted to soaking their beards in water, creating makeshift filters that provided minimal relief. Oddly, the smoke saved some lives even as it harmed others. Its thick layers prevented oxygen from reaching certain areas, starving some fires naturally. Flames that might have exploded with proper airflow instead smoldered reluctantly. Firefighters learned to identify these oxygen-starved zones by the smoke's dull reddish glow, targeting them for demolition efforts, since they represented containment opportunities. Survival strategies emerged through trial and error. Some crews realized smoke rose more slowly in narrow alleys, allowing them to breathe cleaner air near ground level. Others discovered that wrapping wet cloth around their heads provided about 10 minutes of clearer vision before the material dried out. Forward-thinking teams stationed boys with clean water every 100 yards to re-wet these makeshift masks. The smoke's psychological impact proved as debilitating as its physical effects. Firefighters described terrifying moments when they'd open their eyes underwater while rinsing their faces, only to resurface into the same choking darkness. Some developed a superstition that the smoke carried curses from burning churches. Many reported vivid nightmares afterward about being buried alive in soot. As the fire peaked, smoke conditions worsened dramatically. On Tuesday night, witnesses reported smoke columns towering nearly a mile high, visible from over 10 miles away. Falling ash created the illusion of black snowfall, piling inches deep in some areas. The finer particles penetrated everything: clothing, food supplies, even the water barrels meant for firefighting. Teams had to strain drinking water through cloth to remove the worst of the grit. Communication became nearly impossible in the smoke-choked streets. Church bells meant to signal danger couldn't be heard over the fire's roar. Drummers attempted to relay messages through coded beats, but the smoke muffled sound. Runners sent with verbal orders often forgot them after coughing fits. Some commanders resorted to writing notes, only to find the paper disintegrated in the humid, soot-filled air. Firefighters adapted their schedules to the smoke's patterns. Nights brought the worst conditions, as cooling air trapped smoke close to the ground. Daybreak offered brief relief when morning breezes sometimes lifted the haze. The most effective crews worked frantic shifts at dawn, then retreated when smoke pooled again by mid-morning. This rhythm continued until Wednesday, when wind shifts finally began clearing the air near Temple Church. Breathing became its kind of battle. Experienced firefighters learned to take shallow breaths through their noses, exhaling in steady streams to avoid sucking in airborne embers. Some chewed tobacco constantly, believing it protected their lungs. It didn't. The healthiest were those who rotated to rear positions frequently, giving their respiratory systems intermittent rests. But with manpower shortages, few got this luxury. The smoke's legacy lasted long after the fire. Many survivors developed chronic breathing problems they called fire lungs. Those exposed longest reported coughing fits that persisted for years. Some professional firefighters had to retire early because they could no longer tolerate smoke in ordinary house fires. Medical reports from the time describe a condition resembling modern COPD appearing in previously healthy men. Others simply never regained their full lung capacity, a permanent reminder of those 4 days fighting through darkness. Those who endured the smoke developed a peculiar expertise in reading its behavior. They could predict fire intensity by subtle color changes in the haze. Yellowish layers meant burning wood, while black tendrils signaled oil or fabric combustion. Some claimed to navigate by taste, identifying districts by the unique smoke flavors from burning spice warehouses or furniture workshops. These skills meant nothing outside this specific disaster, but in September 1666, they marked the difference between life and death. By Tuesday night, the fire stopped behaving like any normal blaze. The flames had grown so intense, they created their own weather system, a phenomenon we now call a firestorm. Towering columns of heated air rose with such force that they sucked fresh oxygen in from all directions, feeding the destruction like some living beast. Wind speeds near the fire's core exceeded 60 miles per hour, strong enough to knock men off their feet. Firefighters watching from a distance described seeing entire streets lifted into the air as burning debris before being dumped like fiery rain blocks away. Standard firefighting techniques became laughably ineffective. Bucket brigades saw their water evaporate before reaching flames, blown sideways by the hurricane-force winds. Demolition crews trying to create fire breaks found the storm's winds carried embers right over their cleared zones. The heat radiating from the fire made it impossible to stand within 100 feet of the main blaze. Teams working near the Royal Exchange reported their leather boots melting into the cobblestones, forcing them to abandon their posts. The temperatures reached levels barely comprehensible. Contemporary accounts describe lead roof tiles streaming like liquid down stone walls. Glass windows softened and sagged in their frames before shattering. Stone didn't just crack. It exploded when internal moisture turned instantly to steam. Firefighters near St. Paul's Cathedral watched in horror as the great stones of its walls actually glowed red-hot before crumbling. Even the Thames became dangerous, its surface so heated that rescuers couldn't use the water to cool themselves. The fire's physics defied all expectations. Normally, flames need fuel and oxygen, but this inferno created its own airflow. Pyro-CB clouds formed overhead, thunderheads generated by the rising heat that then rained ash and burning debris back down. Fire tornadoes spun through alleys, tearing roofs off buildings ahead of the main fire front. Some crews reported seeing flames actually running along the ground like water, following channels of superheated air. Human psychology couldn't fully process the scale. Grown men who'd faced battle broke down weeping at the sight. Seasoned firefighters simply walked away, their minds refusing to accept what they were seeing. Others became dangerously reckless, charging into flames not from bravery, but because their brains couldn't comprehend such destruction was survivable. The constant roar, louder than any waterfall, made rational thought nearly impossible. Some men later described feeling the sound in their bones for weeks afterward. The firestorm reshaped strategies completely. Forward teams stopped trying to fight the main blaze and instead focused on saving those trapped at the edges. Experienced commanders rotated their men every 30 minutes to prevent heat stroke. Fire hooks became useless. No one could get close enough to use them. Instead, crews used the wind patterns to their advantage, letting it push the fire in predictable directions while they cleared escape routes. Amid the chaos, small miracles of adaptation occurred. Blacksmiths taught fire teams to watch mortar color. When it turned white, a wall was seconds from collapsing. Brewers used their knowledge of liquid flow to redirect what little water was available. Sailors tied ropes around entire teams, so no one got lost in the smoke. The most effective groups stopped trying to resist the firestorm and instead worked with its patterns, like sailors tacking against a hurricane. Radiation burns became the most common injury. Even firefighters working behind the main lines found their exposed skin blistering from pure heat conduction. Some stripped off their wool coats only to have their shirts catch fire from ambient temperature. Men learned to work in rotating pairs, one spraying the other with water every few minutes just to keep their clothing from igniting. The psychological toll manifested strangely. Some firefighters became obsessed with small tasks, like polishing already clean buckets, rather than face the bigger disaster. Others developed superstitious rituals, convinced certain actions could influence the flames. A few experienced auditory hallucinations, hearing church bells or screams that weren't there. The constant orange glow and sleepless nights destroyed all sense of time. Perhaps most terrifying was the firestorm's self-sustaining nature. The hotter it burned, the more wind it created. The more wind, the faster it spread. The faster it spread, the hotter it burned. This feedback loop meant the fire threatened to grow exponentially until nothing remained. Firefighters realized with dawning horror that traditional methods couldn't break this cycle. Only geography or weather change could. Oddly, this realization brought some relief. Once crews accepted they couldn't stop the firestorm, they focused on achievable goals. Saving individual lives became more important than saving buildings. Clearing exit paths took priority over fighting flames. The definition of success shifted from stopping the fire to surviving until it burned out. By Wednesday morning, the firestorm's behavior began changing. The winds shifted slightly, breaking its self-sustaining pattern. The fire no longer created its own weather with the same intensity. Teams noticed the flames moving in more predictable directions. Though still dangerous beyond measure, the fire had returned to something within human comprehension. This change allowed firefighters to implement controlled demolitions at key locations. Their experience from earlier days helped identify which buildings, if collapsed, might guide the fire where they wanted it. The strategy wasn't to extinguish, but to direct, like trying to steer a stampeding herd rather than stop it. As the firestorm's unnatural energy faded, these human efforts started making a measurable difference for the first time in days. When conventional firefighting completely failed on Tuesday night, officials made a desperate decision. They would fight fire with explosions. King Charles II ordered sailors from the Royal Navy to use gunpowder to blast buildings ahead of the fire. This wasn't some reckless gamble. Dutch engineers had used controlled demolitions successfully in Amsterdam just years earlier. The plan was simple. Topple homes in strategic lines before the flames reached them, starving the fire of fuel. But doing this safely in a crowded city with amateur crews presented impossible challenges. The first attempts proved disastrous. An overeager militia squad placed too much powder near the stocks market, accidentally igniting a block that wasn't yet burning. Another crew misunderstood orders and blew up homes directly upwind, sending flaming debris into unburned neighborhoods. The amateur demolition teams lacked measuring tools. They estimated powder amounts by handfuls, sometimes igniting it with lit torches still in hand. Several blasts collapsed the wrong buildings entirely because crews misjudged structural weaknesses. One explosion near Cripplegate hurled stone fragments that killed 3 firefighters instantly. The king quickly realized this needed military precision. He assigned Admiral Sir William Penn, father of Pennsylvania's founder, to oversee demolitions. Penn's sailors had experience with gunpowder storage and fuses. They developed a system, first clearing all people from targeted buildings, then scoring support beams with axes to control collapse direction. A trained gunner would place and light the charge while lookouts watched wind direction. The best crews could clear and demolish a block in under an hour. Unlike the haphazard bucket brigades, these demolition teams worked with strategic purpose. They identified natural choke points where the fire's path could be redirected. Temple Bar's stone gate became a critical battleground. If the fire passed this legal boundary separating London from Westminster, the political heart of England might burn. Sailors created overlapping demolition zones here, carefully timing explosions to push flames eastward, back into already burned areas. This pivot from defense to managed retreat proved crucial. Not everyone agreed with the strategy. Wealthy homeowners near Cheapside bribed guards to spare their properties, creating gaps in fire breaks. Lawyers at the Inner Temple argued demolitions violated property rights even as flames approached. Some firefighters refused to participate, believing the explosions were more dangerous than the fire itself. The controversy grew so heated that the king stationed soldiers to prevent interference with demolition crews. The technique had unexpected benefits beyond fire control. The concussive blasts sometimes stunned the firestorm's wind patterns briefly, allowing crews precious minutes to reinforce adjacent areas. Explosions also cleared rubble that would have taken hours to remove by hand. One sailor's diary describes demolishing a row of houses so thoroughly that the empty lot became an impromptu firebreak, blocking 3 approaching flame fronts. Coordination between teams improved dramatically under naval command. Runners carried demolition permits, signed by the king to prevent friendly fire incidents. Lookouts with whistles warned when wind shifts made blasting unsafe. The Navy even established powder magazines at set intervals, so teams wouldn't waste time retrieving supplies. This military efficiency contrasted sharply with the chaos of earlier days. Here was proof that organization could make a difference. The most successful operation came at Holborn Bridge. Sailors prepped buildings on both sides of the Fleet River, then detonated them simultaneously to collapse inward. The resulting debris dammed the waterway, creating a makeshift reservoir for bucket brigades, while also blocking the fire's westward path. It took 12 precisely timed explosions and 3 failed attempts, but the maneuver finally stopped the fire's advance into Fleet Street. Not every attempt succeeded so cleanly. A demolition near St. Dunstan's Church accidentally ignited a previously contained area, requiring 3 extra hours of firefighting. Poor powder quality sometimes led to dud explosions that wasted critical time. Several crews ran out of fuses and had to improvise with slow-burning rope, giving the fire time to jump their planned break lines. The psychological impact of these explosions was profound. Firefighters described the strange relief of switching from passive defense to active offense. Even when demolitions failed, the sense of fighting back improved morale. One volunteer wrote that hearing the first controlled blast made him feel like David wounding Goliath at last. The booming detonations also served as audible progress reports. Each explosion meant another barrier erected against the flames. By Wednesday afternoon, the demolition strategy had clearly turned the tide. While not extinguishing the fire completely, the coordinated explosions limited its spread long enough for natural barriers and shifting winds to help. The Navy crews became unexpected heroes, their expertise proving more valuable than any bucket brigade. In the end, it wasn't water, but calculated destruction that saved what remained of London. A harsh lesson in choosing the least bad option during catastrophe. This shift to strategic demolitions marked a turning point in the battle. For the first time since Sunday, firefighters weren't just reacting to the flames, but actively shaping their path. The final confrontation would come at Temple Church, where the last unbroken stretch of the city awaited either salvation or destruction. With their new demolition skills and hard-won coordination, the firefighters prepared for their final stand against the exhausted but still dangerous blaze. By Wednesday evening, the fire's western front reached Temple Church, the last defensible point before Westminster. The old stone church stood like a fortress between the burning city and the seat of English government. If flames passed this point, they would sweep unchecked through Parliament, Whitehall Palace, and the Royal Court. Every remaining firefighter understood what was at stake. The wind had finally shifted to the east, giving crews their first real advantage in days. Admiral Penn's demolition teams had already cleared buildings around the church, creating a bare expanse of dirt and rubble. But the fire still pushed forward, fueled by warehouses full of books, paper, and oil near Fleet Street. Now it wasn't just about stopping flames. It was about holding the line long enough for nature to help. Temple Church had survived earlier firestorms largely thanks to its stone construction, but even that wouldn't last forever. The real defense came from the firefighters themselves. Navy crews formed a human chain from the Thames to keep water flowing, while civilian volunteers worked in rotating shifts, 30 minutes battling flames, 10 minutes collapsed on the ground resting. The church's circular design, modelled after Jerusalem's Holy Sepulchre, became both a blessing and curse. Its thick walls resisted heat, but the shape created swirling air currents that could suddenly reignite embers. The final firebreak took shape block by block. Blacksmiths directed the demolition of buildings at exact angles to create overlapping barriers, not just flat gaps, but jagged lines that disrupted wind patterns. Carpenters reinforced Temple Bar's stone gate with water-soaked timbers, turning it into a dam against flying sparks. The most exhausted crews were stationed here. Men who'd been fighting since Sunday could barely lift buckets. but they could still shout warnings and patch-burst hoses. Wind patterns made this the most unpredictable battlefield yet. The firestorm's residual heat created updrafts that sent emeries soaring over the fire breaks. Flames would suddenly burst to life on rooftops crews had soaked just minutes before. Teams had to adapt constantly, shifting their defenses as the wind twisted around the church's unusual shape. Some resorted to extreme measures. Diaries mention men climbing into roofs with axes while fires burned below them, hacking away beams to collapse sections before the whole structure went. The physical condition of the firefighters bordered on collapse. Sailors' hands bled from handling rough ropes and hot debris. Volunteers who'd inhaled smoke for days coughed up black mucus between shouted orders. One account describes a baker who worked 18 hours straight at Temple Bar, his burned arms wrapped in vinegar-soaked rags. Many stripped off their shirts not for comfort, but because the wool fibers melted onto their skin in the heat. What ultimately saved Temple Church wasn't just human effort. It was wind-meeting prepared ground. The demolition teams had cleared enough space that the flames couldn't jump effectively anymore. The church's stone porch acted as a baffle, disrupting the fire's airflow. Around midnight, the wind shifted more decisively eastward, pushing the fire back onto its own burned territory. The exhausted crews barely noticed the turning point at first. They were too busy stamping out hundreds of small fires sparked by floating embers. The real test came in the early hours of Thursday. With reduced wind, the fire burned less intensely, but more stubbornly. Flames crept along the ground through gaps in the firebreak, forcing firefighters into a tedious game of whack-a-mole. Teams crawled through the rubble with wet sacks, smothering each spot fire before it could spread. This grinding work required patience the men scarcely had left. Admiral Penn later wrote that keeping them at their posts was like persuading dead men to stand. Temple's final defense involved an unexpected ally, the church's ancient lead roof. When the intense heat began melting it, the molten lead sealed cracks in the stonework, accidentally creating a fire-resistant shell. This bought precious hours for the bucket brigades to reinforce positions. Meanwhile, gunpowder teams demolished one last row of houses to widen the firebreak, their controlled blasts scattering burning debris directly into the soaked remnants of earlier demolitions. By dawn on Thursday, the impossible became clear. The fire was stopping, not from being extinguished, but from running out of fuel and favorable winds. The flames at Temple Church died back to smoldering patches. Firefighters, too exhausted to cheer, simply slumped where they stood, some falling asleep in puddles or atop piles of rubble. After 4 days of retreat, they'd finally held ground. The fire didn't so much end as fade. Without organized containment, it kept burning in isolated pockets for weeks. But the crisis point had passed. London would lose 13,200 homes, 87 churches, and countless livelihoods. But the political heart of England survived because a ragtag army of volunteers and sailors made their stand at an ancient church. When historians later analysed why the fire stopped at Temple, they noted 3 factors: the wind shift, the disciplined demolitions, and sheer human stubbornness in those final hours. But the firefighters who lived through it remembered something else. The moment they realized the roars and crashes were growing farther apart, the eerie quiet when no new flames appeared on the rooftops. After days of chaos, they'd finally outlasted the beast. As the smoke cleared on Thursday morning, a new challenge emerged. The men who had fought so hard to save London now faced its ravaged remains. and the realization that rebuilding would test them in entirely new ways. As the last embers cooled on Thursday morning, firefighters surveyed a nightmarish landscape. The entire eastern half of London had become a field of blackened ruins stretching to the horizon. Towering stone buildings that had resisted the flames stood like broken teeth amidst the devastation, their windows hollowed out, their roofs gone. The stench of wet ashes mixed with the sickly sweet smell of burnt sugar from destroyed bakeries. Firefighter Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary, "The lanes and streets are so filled with rubbish that no cart nor carriage can pass." The human cost became apparent as the smoke lifted. Of the estimated 1,000 men who fought the fire over 4 days, at least 60 had died, crushed by collapsing buildings, overcome by smoke, or trapped in explosions. Many more would perish in the coming weeks from injuries and lung damage. Volunteer fire captain Thomas Garrard lost both his sons when a wall collapsed on them near the Royal Exchange. Blacksmith Edward Turner worked for 72 hours straight before dropping dead of exhaustion, his hands still clutching an empty bucket. These weren't professional rescuers. They were bakers, carpenters, and sailors who'd answered the call, only to pay the ultimate price. The physical toll on survivors was brutal. Men coughed up black phlegm for weeks, their lungs scarred by smoke inhalation. Burns covered their hands and faces, not just from flames, but from touching superheated tools and stones. Many developed infections from working in the filthy water of the Thames. Eyewitness accounts describe firefighters stumbling through the ruins with bloodied bare feet, their shoes having burned away days earlier. The city's few doctors treated up to 200 men a day for smoke blindness, dehydration, and crush injuries. Emotionally, the men were shattered. Normally, tough labourers broke down weeping when they couldn't find their own homes amidst the ruins. Some developed compulsive behaviours, constantly checking for smoke in the air or refusing to light candles. Others couldn't stop working, obsessively clearing rubble long after the emergency ended. Formerly brave men jumped at sudden noises, their nerves shot from days of explosions and collapsing buildings. The constant orange glow of the fire had rewired their sense of normal. Many reported trouble sleeping in actual darkness afterward. Personal losses mounted quickly. Most firefighters had been tending to others' properties while their own homes burned. Sailor William Pierce thought he'd saved his house near the docks, only to return and find it destroyed by the final night's explosions. Robert Hubert, a French watchmaker who'd helped fight the fire, later falsely confessed to starting it, possibly suffering from what we'd now call survivor's guilt. Guild records show dozens of tradesmen who lost their workshops and tools, ending their livelihoods in an instant. The cityscape they'd defended no longer resembled London. Familiar landmarks had vanished. St. Paul's Cathedral stood as a hollow shell, its famous spire gone. The dense network of alleys and courtyards had become a flat wasteland. Without street signs or boundaries, even long-time residents got lost in their own neighborhoods. The rubble piles stood 6 feet high in places, filled with the remnants of people's lives, melted coins, twisted cooking pots, shattered pottery. Firefighters became reluctant guides, pointing out where streets used to run beneath the debris. Economic devastation followed immediately. Markets couldn't operate without buildings. Craftsmen without tools couldn't work. Thousands slept in tent cities outside the walls or in church crypts, converted to shelters. The king ordered bread distributed from army stores, but supplies ran short within days. Firefighters who'd risked their lives now stood in line for handouts alongside those they'd saved. Many survivors resented seeing the same men who'd fought the fire now begging for food. a bitter reward for their sacrifice. Rebuilding seemed impossible at first. The fire had destroyed 13,200 houses, leaving 70,000 of London's 80,000 residents homeless. The stone perimeter walls of burned buildings still stood in many places, creating ghostly outlines of rooms that no longer existed. Teams of firefighters transitioned to demolition crews, taking down these dangerous remnants. The work was familiar, pulling down walls with hooks and ropes, but now done in eerie silence rather than urgent shouts. Some firefighters couldn't handle the aftermath. Several were committed to Bedlam Hospital with what physicians called fire madness, likely severe PTSD. Others turned to alcohol, spending what little money they had on gin to dull the memories. A few left London entirely, seeking work in undamaged cities where they wouldn't be reminded daily of the disaster. The ones who stayed often did so out of obligation. Their neighborhoods needed every able body for reconstruction. Yet the experience also forged unexpected resilience. Firefighters who'd worked side by side formed lasting bonds. The same men who'd passed buckets together now pooled resources to rebuild. Guilds gave special membership to volunteers, recognizing their service. The king issued silver medals to surviving crew leaders, one of the earliest known awards for civilian bravery. These small recognitions couldn't replace what was lost, but they helped men grieve and move forward. The fire changed London's firefighters forever. They'd seen the city at its worst and somehow kept working. Their understanding of fire's behavior became instinctive. Years later, veteran firefighters could predict a building's collapse just by the sound of its burning. The disaster transformed their role from casual volunteers into something resembling a professional force. When new fire safety laws required each parish to maintain proper equipment, it was these scarred veterans who trained the next generation. Their greatest legacy emerged in London's rebuilding. The men who'd witnessed the fire's rapid spread firsthand advised architects on wider streets and brick construction. Firefighters helped design the city's first true water mains after remembering how bucket brigades failed. The same demolition techniques used to create fire breaks became standard emergency procedures. Though their names are mostly forgotten, these ordinary men reshaped urban safety forever, turning hard lessons into life-saving reforms. The next time disaster struck, London would be ready. The physical toll on London's firefighters became apparent as soon as the adrenaline wore off. These men had worked for days without proper rest, inhaling toxic smoke, while their skin burned from radiant heat. Many collapsed where they stood when the fire finally receded, their bodies shutting down after unbelievable strain. Volunteer John Evelyn wrote in his diary, "I saw them fall down in the streets, their lips blue and their nails black, looking more like corpses than living men." The most common injuries came from smoke inhalation. Without masks or oxygen, firefighters breathed in swirling particles of wood, tar, and toxic chemicals for hours. Their throats swelled shut, their lungs filled with fluid. Some coughed up black mucus for weeks afterward. The fortunate ones recovered over months, but others developed chronic breathing problems that never fully healed. 17th century doctors called this condition fire lungs, describing patients who struggled to walk uphill or suffered sudden coughing fits years later. Burns covered hands, faces, and legs. Unlike modern protective gear, the wool coats and leather boots firefighters wore offered little protection. Many worked until their shoes melted onto their feet, leaving raw blisters. Thomas Vincent, a preacher who helped fight the blaze, described men whose beards were singed clean off, their eyelids swollen shut from the heat. The worst cases came from those who'd entered burning buildings. Their hands bore deep burns from touching superheated door handles and tools. Eye injuries were rampant. Smoke and flying embers damaged corneas, leaving some firefighters temporarily or permanently blinded. The few eye doctors in London treated hundreds of cases of fire blindness. Most prescribed dubious remedies like rosewater rinses or leech applications. Wealthier victims could afford glass eye patches, while the poor simply adapted to impaired vision. Guild records show several older firefighters had to retire after losing their sight entirely. Exhaustion caused its own damage. Men who'd worked for 72 hours straight suffered heart attacks or strokes. Others developed tremors that never left their hands. Navy surgeon Richard Wiseman documented cases where fit young sailors returned from firefighting with permanent muscle damage from overexertion. The heart muscle could only take so much strain. Several firefighters dropped dead weeks later from what we'd now recognize as stress cardiomyopathy. Medical care was primitive at best. Barber surgeons, the era's emergency medics, could set broken bones from collapses but had no treatments for smoke inhalation. They used vinegar-soaked cloths for burns, which often led to infections. Opium helped with pain, but caused addictions. Many injured firefighters ended up in the charnel houses of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, lying on dirty straw pallets, while overworked nurses tended them. The survival rates tell a grim story. Of about 1,000 active firefighters, contemporary accounts suggest 60 died during the disaster itself, but at least 200 more perished in the following year from related conditions. Parish records show unusual spikes in deaths from lung fever and decay in firefighter-heavy neighborhoods. The average lifespan of those who fought the Great Fire appears to have been 10 to 15 years shorter than their peers. Communities did what they could for these broken men. Wealthy households took in injured volunteers, despite the overcrowding after the fire. Churches collected donations for medical care. One surviving ledger lists payments for 20 poultices for burn hands. The Worshipful Company of Blacksmiths granted lifelong pensions to members disabled in the firefighting efforts. King Charles II even ordered special payments to such common men as stood longest against the flames. Some parishes developed early rehabilitation systems. Crippled firefighters taught fire prevention to children in exchange for food. The Guild of Carpenters trained injured volunteers as equipment inspectors, since their knowledge of fire behavior remained valuable. A few found work testing building materials to see how they burned. A morbid but necessary job in the rebuilt city. The physical struggles never really ended. Farmers reported seeing former firefighters collapse in fields when smoke from brush fires triggered remembered trauma. Brewers who'd fought the blaze couldn't work near kilns anymore. The heat brought back panic. Some men's hands shook too badly to return to their old trades as watchmakers or scribes. Their bodies had become living records of the disaster. Yet these men formed the backbone of London's recovery. Their scarred hands helped clear rubble. Their damaged lungs still shouted warnings about fire risks. When new safety laws required brick chimneys and wider streets, it was often the injured firefighters inspecting the work. They turned personal suffering into public safeguards. The psychological scars ran even deeper than the physical ones. Many couldn't sleep without nightmares of roaring flames. Others jumped at the sound of church bells, the fire alarm still ringing in their heads years later. Some developed obsessive habits, constantly checking buckets or stairwell exits. Their experiences had rewired how they saw the world. 17th century England had no concept of PTSD. but people understood what happened to these men. They called it fire madness, when a veteran couldn't stop reliving the trauma. Clergymen wrote about firefighters who woke screaming about burning children only they could see. The standard treatments, bleeding, prayer, or confinement, did little to help. The community response was surprisingly modern. Neighbors learned not to invite fire victims to candlelit dinners. Wives knew when to distract husbands during chimney fires. Some parishes exempted traumatized volunteers from fire watch duties. These small accommodations recognized something we'd now call survivor's guilt or triggers. A few firefighters left written accounts that reveal their anguish. Former sailor William Taswell described waking years later, with the taste of smoke in my mouth and the screams still in my ears. Another, John Allen, wrote to his sister, "I see the faces of those we couldn't save every time I close my eyes at church." Their words give us rare glimpses into 17th century trauma. The nightmare started almost immediately. Firefighters who had seemed strong during the crisis began waking their families with screams in the night. John Evelyn wrote about a neighbor who'd fought the flames. The man couldn't sleep without reliving the collapse of buildings where people were trapped inside. 17th century London had no word for PTSD, but everyone recognized fire madness when they saw it. Men who had calmly walked into burning streets now panicked at the smell of roasting meat. Others jumped at the sound of church bells ringing normally. The psychological toll showed in strange ways. Some former volunteers developed obsessive habits, constantly checking buckets of water or counting exits in buildings. Thomas Vincent described a sailor who would only sleep near open windows after spending days choking on smoke. Blacksmith Robert Hubert, who later falsely confessed to starting the fire, may have been suffering from what we'd now call survivor's guilt. Witnesses said he muttered about the faces in the flames before his execution. Contemporary accounts describe classic trauma symptoms. Many firefighters couldn't tolerate being in crowds after the pushing masses of the firefighting efforts. Others suffered auditory hallucinations, hearing screams or crackling flames that weren't there. Some developed thousand-yard stares, barely reacting when spoken to. The physician Richard Wiseman wrote of patients who showed a great disturbance of the spirits after the fire, suffering from both insomnia and terrifying dreams when they did sleep. 17th century medicine had limited ways to explain these reactions. Doctors blamed an imbalance of the humors or suggested demonic influence. Standard treatments included bloodletting, purging, and prayers, none of which helped much. The more compassionate physicians prescribed opium, which at least allowed some sleep. Clergymen advised prayer and repentance, believing trauma was divine punishment. Some suggested victims wear amulets containing biblical verses to ward off evil spirits. Coping mechanisms developed naturally. Many firefighters avoided speaking about their experiences, burying the memories. Others talked obsessively, retelling their stories until they became rote. Some turned to alcohol. Gin sales spiked in fire-affected areas during the rebuilding years. The Worshipful Company of Pewterers recorded several members drinking themselves to death after losing both homes and health in the firefighting efforts. Personal accounts reveal the depth of suffering. Former sailor William Taswell wrote about waking years later, with the taste of smoke in my mouth and the screams still in my ears. Bookseller John Allen told his sister in a letter, "I see the faces of those we couldn't save every time I close my eyes at church." These weren't professional writers trying to dramatize events, just ordinary men trying to express what they couldn't understand. Some responses seem surprisingly modern. Neighbors learned not to place fire veterans near hearths. Families developed quiet signals to warn when someone was staring too long at candles. The Guild of Cordwainers established a rule excusing firefighting members from working near open flames. These small accommodations recognized trauma before psychology had words for it. The community response was both compassionate and practical. Churches relaxed attendance requirements for those who panicked in crowded services. Wealthy households hired traumatized firefighters for light work that kept them outdoors. Some parishes assigned them to teach fire safety to children, a way to process experiences while helping others. Ironically, the men most affected by fire often became the most vigilant about preventing future disasters. Long-term effects became apparent. Some former volunteers moved to the countryside, unable to tolerate rebuilt London's constant construction noises that sounded like collapsing buildings. Others changed professions. Butchers who couldn't stand fires started bakeries. Bakers moved to candle making. The physician Nathaniel Hodges noted that affected men tended to either avoid all risks or become recklessly brave, having already faced their worst fears. Sleep disturbances were among the most persistent issues. Many kept to nocturnal schedules ever after. Their circadian rhythms permanently altered by 4 days, without proper rest. Apothecary records show ongoing demand for drowsy syrups, containing opium and lettuce extracts in firefighter neighborhoods. Some men slept only in chairs for years, afraid of not being able to escape quickly from beds. The trauma crossed social lines. Wealthy merchants suffered alongside poor laborers. Money couldn't shield anyone from memories. The diarist Samuel Pepys, who helped organize firefighting efforts, wrote months later about still being unable to look at burning candles without distress. King Charles II reportedly panicked during a small palace kitchen fire months after the disaster, ordering the whole wing evacuated unnecessarily. Some coping methods were more productive. Former firefighters became early advocates for better mental health treatment. Thomas Dangerfield petitioned the city to provide financial support for those driven mad by fire service, though his request was denied. Others channeled their experiences into creative work. One anonymous poem from 1667 reads like a textbook case of survivor's guilt, questioning why the author lived when so many perished. The most damaged often wound up in Bethlehem Hospital, known as Bedlam, where treatments were harsh. Records show at least 12 firefighters were committed there in the 5 years following the disaster. Treatments included cold baths, restraints, and beatings meant to drive out madness. Some improved enough to be released, though many didn't. A few ended their own lives. Parish registers note sudden burials, where causes of death were left suspiciously blank. Yet many found ways to live with their memories. Former volunteer fire teams often reunited annually to share meals and stories. Some deliberately rebuilt their homes near each other, creating supportive communities. Others focused on training new generations of firefighters, turning trauma into hard-won lessons. Their experiences shaped how London would respond to disasters for centuries to come. The Great Fire left marks no one could see. Broken ribs healed, burns scarred over, but the nightmares lingered. These men had faced something beyond normal human experience. Days of relentless horror, where familiar streets became death traps. 17th century London lacked modern psychology, but it developed its own ways to help survivors cope. When we think about PTSD today, we're seeing the same human reactions these firefighters experienced, just with better names for them and slightly better ways to help. In the days after the fire, Londoners didn't know whether to thank the firefighters or blame them. On one hand, these men had worked tirelessly for days, risking their lives. On the other, the city lay in ruins, and someone had to be held responsible. The truth was more complicated than either side wanted to admit. The criticism started quietly at first. Wealthy merchants whose properties burned questioned why firefighters saved churches instead of warehouses full of goods. Homeowners who lost everything wondered why certain blocks were demolished to create fire breaks while others stood untouched. A pamphleteer named George Thompson wrote that the firefighters ran about like headless chickens, saving naught but the properties of their friends. These accusations grew louder as London took stock of its losses. Political leaders saw an opportunity. The king's opponents used the fire to attack his government, suggesting poor planning made the disaster worse. Some members of parliament spread rumours that Catholic firefighters had deliberately failed to save Protestant churches. Others claimed Dutch volunteers, England's enemy in ongoing wars, had actually helped the fire spread. There was little truth to these claims, but they persisted in the angry, traumatized city. Specific accusations emerged in the weeks after the fire. A group of distillers claimed firefighters let their alcohol stores burn to create an inferno, rather than using water from the nearby Thames to save them. The worshipful company of bakers accused crews of ignoring the crowded tenements near their guild hall. Most damning were claims that firefighters had taken bribes to save certain properties while letting others burn. No evidence supported this, but the rumour spread quickly among displaced residents. Modern disaster researchers would recognise this pattern. After catastrophes, people often blame first responders for systemic failures beyond their control. The firefighters faced impossible decisions with inadequate tools, but survivors needed someone to hold accountable. The more Londoners struggled in makeshift camps outside the city, the angrier they became at those who hadn't stopped their suffering. The firefighters did have defenders. Bookseller John Allen wrote to his brother that no mortal men could have done more against such flames. Navy officers who'd supervised demolitions testified about the volunteers' bravery. King Charles himself praised the firefighters at a public ceremony, handing out silver medals to some crew leaders. But these gestures couldn't counter the growing backlash. The volunteer companies fought back quietly. Church records show firefighters giving sermons about their efforts, describing impossible choices between saving lives and saving property. Guild halls displayed melted tools and burned buckets as evidence of their struggle. Some veterans walked through the ruins as living proof, their coughs and burns showing what they'd endured. Official inquiries began that November. The King's Council heard testimony about the fire's spread. Firefighters described how winds carried flames over their defences. Building experts explained why narrow streets doomed containment efforts. While the final report didn't assign direct blame, it noted the lack of coordinated leadership and proper equipment. This partial vindication came too late for many volunteers who'd already left the city in disgrace. Privately, many firefighters felt betrayed. Men who'd worked until their hands bled now faced accusations of cowardice. Some who'd lost homes while saving others' property found themselves called thieves. A few couldn't take the criticism. Blacksmith James Grant drowned himself in the Thames, leaving a note saying he could not bear the eyes of those who called me villain. His parish priest recorded the funeral with unusual detail, noting Grant had burned his arm saving children from a collapsing school. The truth emerged slowly as London rebuilt. People realized no human effort could have stopped such a fire with the tools available. Wealthy merchants who'd blamed firefighters now hired them as consultants, for safer building designs. The same politicians who spread rumors quietly dropped them when proposing fire prevention laws. Even critical pamphleteers changed their tone, praising the volunteers' bravery while still criticizing city leaders. By 1667, perceptions had shifted enough that the Common Council established London's first organised fire patrols. Many original firefighters joined, their hard-won experience now valued rather than questioned. The King granted pensions to several disabled volunteers, a tacit admission they'd been wronged. When small fires broke out during rebuilding, people didn't complain about the responders. They cheered them. The controversy revealed how disasters test communities. London needed someone to blame before it could heal, and the firefighters became temporary targets. Their eventual vindication showed the city coming to terms with hard truths about poor planning, about inadequate resources, about how easily civilization can burn. These men became living reminders of both failure and resilience. Their scars proved what they'd endured, even as critics questioned their actions. In the end, London's rebuilding honoured them more than any medal could. The wider streets, brick construction, and organised fire services they helped design became their real legacy. The fire had shown what happened when a city wasn't prepared. The firefighters, first scorned then celebrated, ensured it would never happen again. Their story became part of London's rebirth, not as scapegoats or heroes, but as ordinary men who'd done extraordinary things under impossible conditions. Now the city faced a new challenge, creating systems so no one would have to be so brave again. The old way of fighting fires had failed London completely. Before 1666, there were no professional fire crews, just volunteers who would grab buckets when the church bells rang backwards. The city's narrow streets and wooden buildings had turned into a death trap, and everyone knew the system needed to change. The first reforms came quickly. Within weeks of the fire, King Charles II issued a proclamation banning thatched roofs in the city. Builders were ordered to use brick or stone instead of wood for new construction. Streets would be wider now. No more alleys where flames could jump easily from house to house. These weren't suggestions. If you rebuilt your home the old way, it would be torn down. London's firefighters played a surprising role in designing the new safety measures. Men who had survived the fire were consulted about building materials and street layouts. They explained how certain types of stone cracked under heat, or how different roof shapes affected flame spread. Their hard-won experience became the foundation of London's first real building codes. The water supply system got overhauled completely. Remembering how wells ran dry during the fire, engineers designed new wood pipe networks fed by the Thames. These primitive water mains had outlets every 120 feet where firefighters could connect hoses. It wasn't perfect, the wooden pipes often leaked, but it was better than passing buckets hand to hand. The city also built more public reservoirs and cleared access paths to the river. Firefighting equipment improved dramatically. Each parish now kept standardized tools, not just buckets, but proper fire hooks, ladders, and hand-pumped water squirts. The old leather buckets were replaced with stronger canvas ones. Fire stations appeared for the first time, though they were really just sheds storing equipment. Most importantly, the city started keeping records of which buildings had fire hazards like overloaded storerooms or faulty chimneys. The biggest change was in organization. Instead of random volunteers, London established trained fire patrols under the direction of constables. These weren't full-time firefighters yet, but they practiced regularly and knew the new equipment. The city was divided into districts with clear chains of command, so when a fire broke out, Everyone knew their role instead of running around chaotically. Insurance companies accelerated these reforms. After losing millions in the Great Fire, they formed their own private fire brigades to protect client properties. These were the first professional fire crews in England, paid to respond quickly with proper gear. They marked insured buildings with metal plaques called fire marks, early versions of the fire department logos we know today. Former firefighters became London's first fire prevention inspectors. They walked the new, wider streets, checking for hazards. Piles of straw left near bakeries blocked alleyways or overloaded warehouses. Some were hired to test building materials, seeing how long different types of wood or plaster could resist flames. Their brutal experience during the Great Fire made them experts at spotting risks others missed. The legal system changed too. Arson became a capital crime punishable by hanging. Homeowners could now be fined for unsafe chimneys or blocked fire exits. Fire wardens got real authority to enforce these rules instead of just issuing warnings. Courts even established that firefighters couldn't be sued for property damage during emergency demolitions, a huge relief to men who remembered the post-fire blame game. Perhaps the most important innovation was psychological. Londoners developed a new awareness of fire danger that hadn't existed before. Families actually rehearsed escape routes from their homes. Businesses kept fire buckets and ladders handy instead of storing them away. The city started keeping night watchmen specifically to look for fires, the origin of today's fire alarm systems. People stopped assuming it can't happen here because they'd seen it happen everywhere. The changes weren't perfect. Many poor areas still had dangerous conditions, and the new building codes were often ignored outside wealthy districts. But the overall transformation was remarkable. Within 50 years, London had fire insurance, professional brigades, water mains, building inspectors, and safety laws, a complete system where none had existed before. Former firefighters saw their nightmares turned into progress. The same men who'd suffered through the Great Fire now trained younger generations in proper techniques. Some became famous consultants, hired by other cities wanting to avoid London's fate. Their knowledge spread through manuals like The Art of Firefighting, which distilled hard lessons into clear instructions for new crews. The disaster had forced London to confront its vulnerabilities. What emerged was smarter than anyone could have imagined before the flames. Simple things we take for granted today: fire hydrants, building codes, professional responders, all trace back to that week in 1666. The firefighters who survived didn't just rebuild their city. They reinvented how cities worldwide would protect themselves from fire forever. These men carried scars from the disaster, but also something else: the knowledge that their suffering had meaning. Every brick chimney, every widened street, every new fire pump stood as proof that lessons had been learned. Their legacy wasn't just in what was lost, but in all the lives and homes that would be saved in centuries to come. Now we turn to the personal stories of those who shaped this legacy. The firefighters who left behind rare accounts of what they saw and endured. Their words give us glimpses into history that official records can't capture, revealing the human cost behind the reforms we've just explored. Most of London's firefighters were illiterate labourers whose stories died with them, but a handful left written accounts, scratched in margins of church records, tucked into letters, or dictated to scribes. These fragments give us our only direct window into what these men actually experienced during those 4 horrific days. Samuel Pepys's famous diary gives the most complete account. As a naval administrator, He helped organize firefighting efforts while documenting the chaos around him. His entry for September 2nd reads, "All the sky was of a fiery aspect, like the top of a burning oven, and the light seen above 40 miles round about. People do now all cry out against the manner of pulling down houses in the beginning." Unlike official reports, Pepys admits the ineffective early responses, how firefighters hesitated to create fire breaks until it was too late. More surprising are the working-class voices that survived. James Shorthouse, a baker who fought the flames near Pudding Lane, left testimony in his parish registry. "We pulled at the roof with hooks, but the heat drove us back. Goodwife Wilkins screamed from the window till the floor gave way." His blunt description reveals what formal accounts omit: the sounds of victims firefighters couldn't reach, the helplessness of inadequate tools. Interpreting these accounts requires care. Many were written years later, memories coloured by trauma and shifting public opinion. Thomas Vincent, a preacher who helped coordinate bucket brigades, originally described firefighters as heroes, but in a later revised account, he added criticisms about drunkenness and looting, likely influenced by post-fire scandals. The words are genuine, but the filters change. Some of the most revealing descriptions come from sailors' logs. Navy crews brought in to do controlled demolitions kept professional records. Lieutenant William Hickers's journal notes, "At 3 bells, blew 3 houses east of Temple. Smoke so thick the powder men could scarcely see the fuses. Lost 1 man, Roberts, when a wall fell unexpected." These matter-of-fact entries document dangers regular firefighters face constantly without naval discipline or equipment. The accounts agree on sensory details that official reports ignore. Multiple witnesses describe the strange metallic taste of superheated air. Nearly all mention the sound, not just roaring flames, but the constant gunshot-like pops of limestone exploding. Blacksmith Edward Taylor's dictated account says, "The nails in my boots grew hot as kettle bottoms. My hair crisped in the heat before the flames reached us." Such details make the experience visceral in ways statistics cannot. Personal writings reveal struggles beyond the flames. Volunteer John Allen's letters complain about constant thirst. "No drink to be had but Thames water mixed with ashes which we strained through our shirts." Others describe blistered hands slipping on wet ropes, or boots melting into cobblestones. These mundane hardships shape the disaster as much as dramatic rescues. The most haunting passages concern impossible choices. Brewer Thomas Hayne wrote to his brother, "We saved the church but let the schoolhouse burn, there being but 8 buckets to share betwixt them." Such admissions rarely appeared in official defences of firefighters' actions. Captain Valentine Knight's journal admits leaving a street to burn because the wind favoured saving the Guildhall instead. Research suggests these accounts represent broader experiences. Historians comparing multiple sources find consistent patterns: the sudden wind shifts, the failure of certain tactics, the moments of unexpected success. What seems like individual memory often aligns with physical evidence, like burn patterns on surviving buildings. The personal writings aren't just anecdotes, they're data points about disaster response. Several accounts mention the same forgotten heroes. Pepys praises a one-legged shipwright who directed our demolitions more ably than the mayor. Multiple letters describe an unnamed milkmaid who organized water carriers. These figures appear too often to be fabrications, revealing how ordinary people stepped up when systems failed. Some writings take on almost poetic quality despite their author's lack of education. Cordwainer Gregory Carter's testament includes, The stars vanished by Monday night, not by cloud, but by the smoke of our burning lives rising up to blot them out. Others use vivid metaphors, flames running like foxes across roofs, or embers swarming like angry bees. The documents show firefighters grasping at explanations. Many blame the Dutch or Catholics, reflecting contemporary prejudices. Others cite divine judgment, but some reveal remarkable insight. Shipmaster William Taswell theorized correctly about wind fueling the firestorm. It sucked air like sails pulling a ship, feeding itself faster than we could starve it. Ultimately, these accounts agree on one profound point. The firefighters knew they were overmatched. Hayne writes, "We did not fail through want of effort, but through want of means." This echoes across letters and diaries. Not excuses, but hard-won understanding of their limits. Few writings mention hopes for reform. These men documented what they saw, not what might come later. Yet reading between the lines, you sense quiet determination. When Carter describes teaching neighbors to space their new homes wider, or Pepys notes inspecting prototype fire pumps, we see seeds of change being planted. These fragments survive by chance. A diary rescued from rubble, a letter tucked in a Bible, testimony recorded by parish priests. Together, they form a mosaic far richer than any single official report. The voices are scratched on paper, shaky with exhaustion or grief, but they speak across centuries with startling clarity. Now we consider how London remembered these ordinary men, not through their own words, but through memorials built by others. The firefighters memorialized their lost comrades in ways both formal and personal, creating traditions that endure today. Most of London's firefighters in 1666 left no names behind. They were working men whose lives rarely appeared in official records unless they committed crimes or owed taxes. Parish registers list some first names: William the Cooper, Thomas the Bricklayer, but not their firefighting service. The only proof they fought the flames often comes from scattered mentions in other people's accounts. Samuel Pepys's diary describes 3 stout mariners directing bucket brigades near the Thames, but we'll never know who they were. Records disappeared for simple reasons. The fire destroyed many church registries and guild membership rolls that might have listed volunteers. Survivors focused on rebuilding rather than documenting who helped. Many firefighters died within months from injuries, leaving no one to tell their stories. Others moved away, their contributions forgotten in new communities. The poor left the faintest traces. A 1667 census taker noted John of All Hallows, much burnt in face and hands, living in a temporary shack, but didn't record his full name or what he'd done. A handful of names survived through chance. Navy Lieutenant William Hickes appears in Admiralty records for leading demolition crews. Blacksmith Edward Turner was mentioned in multiple accounts before dying of exhaustion. Thomas Garrard, a volunteer captain, got noted in St. Margaret's parish records for losing 2 sons in the firefighting efforts. These men represent thousands more whose names we'll never know. The anonymity reflects 17th century priorities. Chroniclers documented the grand architecture destroyed, not the common men who tried saving it. Wealthy victims listed their losses in insurance claims, while poor firefighters couldn't afford such paperwork. Guilds recorded members who paid dues, not necessarily those who volunteered. The few surviving payrolls from reconstruction crews suggest thousands helped fight the flames, but only as labourer or workman. Efforts to memorialise began surprisingly early. In 1670, the rebuilt St. Magnus the Martyr Church installed a plaque honouring all those brave souls who battled the flames. The Worshipful Company of Blacksmiths added firefighting service to their membership rolls, preserving some names that way. A now lost mural near Moorgate reportedly depicted volunteer crews, though it crumbled within decades. These weren't grand monuments, but they showed communities remembering. Modern historians piece together clues where they can. Fire insurance records sometimes note policyholders who were known firefighters in 1666. Court documents reveal identities when former volunteers sued for unpaid wages during Reconstruction. Some names survive through oral histories. Generations of London brewers passed down stories about an ancestor who organised alehouse bucket brigades. The Guildhall Library holds one of the most touching memorials, a handwritten list from 1667 titled Men Much Burnt. It records injuries treated at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Richard W., left hand melted to hook. James H., face bones showing where flesh fell away. No surnames, just enough to identify men to their neighbours. The entries stop abruptly when the scribe ran out of names he could verify. Contemporary accounts suggest the firefighters themselves preferred practical memorials. Survivors reportedly demanded wider streets and better water access during rebuilding. Many insisted their children learn fire safety. Parish schools added it to curricula by 1670. Some veterans became unofficial inspectors, roaming new construction sites pointing out fire risks. Their living memorial was a safer city. The Great Fire's 350th anniversary in 2016 sparked new remembrance efforts.